Yes, guys, welcome back to another Lily White Lounge. Here with my usual co-host Travis, and we've also got a special guest today. Firstly, Travis, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right, Kish. How are you? Glad
Yeah,
to
I'm
be
not
here
too bad.
again.
I'm not too bad, mate. Not great after the weekend's result, but we'll get into that. We're
Yeah,
joined by Ben Bowman as well, who's doing his own great stuff on mainly TikTok. A big Spurs fan. How you doing, Ben?
Good, thank you, mate. Pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you, bro. So yeah, we'll quickly get into, I guess, a match that was a really difficult watch. In my eyes, anyway, I thought it was one of the worst performances of the season. It just seemed sort of naive and just flat in general. We were never really dominant in the game, um, missing some key personnel as well. Um, but yeah, Travis, I'll start with you. What do you kind of see as the reasons for that kind of performance, and I guess both personnel wise and tactically?
yeah. I think that was the key point I was going to make. Is a few times this season, it's just been the personnel that have let us down. I think, and that's we've sort of come away from that feeling almost encouraged in a way in terms of the long term outlook because we've sort of thought, okay, once we get rid of the deadwoods and get rid of the players that might not be up to standard, then you can really push on. But I think the game against Wolves, or whilst the personnel obviously wasn't good enough in terms of Davis and Emerson, and even the likes of Son and Richarlison weren't firing, it seemed to be more of a structural issue paired with that. And that was the real big concern for me in that I think Ange's system really showed its flaws in that game and showed how actually we might have been protected by it by the players we have so far this season, rather than actually the players not being there being the reason for the structure failing.
Yeah, I think you're pretty spot on. I think this is one of the first games where I've sort of put the whole performance down to Ange and kind of, I guess, there's always going to be issues within a side starting 11 that fans want to be improved and want certain players to be upgraded on or whatever, but you still have to adapt to who's available and adapt to your team. You can't go into a fixture and just expect results just because you're playing a certain way. Um, and I think this was a prime example of that. Ben, what were your kind of general thoughts? And then we'll get into some more specific stuff.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree. It was the first time I've left the ground this season, sort of feeling a little bit more concerned about not necessarily where we're going, but about Ange's tactics and maybe the naivety of going into that game, especially without two of your most important players. And I think it made us realise how important that Porro and Doggy are, even though we all knew that anyway. We can see with our eyes how good they are, and we know that despite the fact that Ben Davis and Emerson Royale have come and done a job for us this season, albeit at centre back for the most part, we can rely on them, but they do harm us. So they do restrict us in some way as well in terms of our build up. And we all knew that was going to be a problem going into the game. But it just felt flat from the first minute, really. The crowd felt flat. The players, none of it felt right. And, as obviously Spurs fans for a fairly decent portion of our lives, we know you get that feeling sometimes where you turn up to the ground and just think, well, it's going to be one of those days today. Wolves have become a bit of a bogey team for us anyway. And it felt reminiscent of so many games at White Hart Lane and at the new stadium just against that specific team that you just thought this is going to be a challenge. And it was. And I thought when we played Wolves away, despite the fact that we were kind of decimated by injuries, that was kind of the first game picking up the pieces after the Chelsea result. We didn't play well. And I was full of praise for Wolves on that day. I thought they were much better than us. But I didn't even think that was necessarily the case on Saturday. I didn't think they had to be much better than us to win on Saturday. We just kind of played into their hands and just it wasn't. Yeah, the tempo wasn't good enough. I don't think he could have necessarily. Obviously, you guys kind of raised an interesting point, and a lot of people on Twitter last week, and a lot of people kind of picked up on, well, how are we going to combat Porro and Doggy not being there? I liked your guys' suggestion of potentially moving Romero to right back, but I always felt that as if he was going to go with Emerson and Davis. Although I do think if Porro potentially isn't back for the next game, that is something we could explore. So I think we knew that there was going to be challenges going into it. So everyone was kind of going to the ground a little bit flat anyway because of that, because of how tough we knew it was going to be. But I came away quite concerned, and to be honest, I think that was probably the worst performance I think we've put in this season, because I think some of the other poor performances that we have had a lot more kind of nuance and context to them, and I think we've played a lot better than we did on Saturday with far fewer of our star players available. But again, I think it does show how important the fullbacks are, and I think that's an area we've got to address going into the summer. But it was just flat. It was just very, very flat. I think that's the only real way to describe it.
Yeah, I think the fullbacks is definitely a good topic of discussion, because I have a lot of thoughts on this. And I think, first of all, if we touch on, I guess, Porro and Udogie in general, their role in this team is the most physically demanding in my eyes. I guess Van de Ven is doing more sprints, but Porro and Udogie, the amount of running and ground they have to cover, I haven't looked at the stats, but I'd assume they're the most have the most distance covered, because they're being options in build up at times. They're then playing much higher at times in like sort of number 10 positions, and they're underlapping, overlapping even at times, especially in the case of Porro. And then if the ball then gets turned over, they're doing 50-yard sprints all the way back to cover those wide areas. So that's just a crazy amount of running. And I always thought this day would come where they were going to pick up injuries or look fatigued. And I've been calling for a little bit more rotation. I guess we haven't really had any games where it's been comfortable, where we could sort of take them off at 60 minutes or whatever. But I think Ange's rotation hasn't been the best. And I also get that it's not his squad yet, so he hasn't got as many options as he may like. But I still even think in other positions, the rotation hasn't been great. So that's obviously part of why they kind of, obviously, I think why they've picked up these injuries. But Travis, what were your thoughts about, I guess, his choice of playing Emerson and Davies, and then also not really tweaking their roles which suited to their profile, if that makes sense? Like what kind of continuing with the Porro and Udogie roles, but just playing kind of lesser players there.
Yeah, I understood playing Emerson and Davis, as Ben said, we sort of expected it anyway. And the tweets about Romero and the points made about playing Romero right back or Van de Ven left back were more sort of what could happen, but it was unlikely anyway. And I'm okay with that, because it was one game, and I think the mindset going into the match was, this is one game, we have a week off next week, let's just go with what's reliable, and there's no point experimenting when it may not happen the next game onwards anyway. But as Ben said, I think that if Porro isn't available for, is it Palace we have next?
Yeah, I think so.
Palace. If Porro isn't available for Palace, then maybe he might try something else out. So I don't have a problem with Davis and Emerson playing, but as you said, the problem is they're playing in the exact same way that Porro and Udogie do, and they simply can't. They don't have the physical ability to do so. They don't have the technical ability. But for me, most importantly, the inverted fullbacks, what they do, their high and aggressive positioning leaves a lot of space. And it means that, we'll get onto this, but it means that the number 6 has so much lateral space to cover, all on their own a lot of the time. And that's without mentioning the space it leaves in behind for Van de Ven and Romero to deal with. And that's been an issue this season already, and we've seen it, and we've conceded in transition a lot. We've conceded in the wide areas a lot, and it's been a problem. But it's almost sort of been counteracted and sort of been like, okay, we can accept that because we're so exciting going forwards and we're so effective going forwards. And you see Udogie making these driving runs and you think, how can you restrict him when he's doing that? It's just so effective and entertaining. And you see Porro playing in sort of that right half space and maybe hanging back a bit, but playing those brilliant whips balls into the box or sometimes overlapping. And he's so effective there. that you sort of think to yourself, okay, we'll take the defensive vulnerabilities because that's Ange ball, essentially. That's going for it. But when you have Davies and Emerson in there, firstly, that attacking threat is completely nullified and they become useless in those situations. I mean, Davies is decent at getting into positions, as we saw, but once he gets there, he can't do much anyway. And importantly for me, I think, is they don't have the technical ability to retain possession either. So Udogie's ball retention is brilliant because of his physicality and obviously technical ability, but I think it's less. His technical ability isn't as good as Porro, as we know, and Porro's technical ability allows him to secure possession even when he's attempting those more risky passes, and that means that we turn the ball over less in the final third when they're potentially in attacking positions, and therefore the less we turn the ball over, the less vulnerable we are on the counter-attack. So it's sort of two things for me in Davies and Emerson in that. One is their attacking threat isn't as high, and two is they're turning the ball over more, and then we're more vulnerable to counter-attacks.
Yeah, and I think there's it's spot on. And for me, this is one of the first times I remember early in the season where Gary Neville, I think, like incorrectly said about Ange that he was just sort of using inverted fullbacks for the sake of it and just copying Pep, and there was kind of a lot of backlash from Spurs fans about that, and I was one of them because I always saw the reasoning for inverted fullbacks. I thought we've got two of the best fullbacks in the league. We kind of overload the middle to dominate those central areas, and then leave kind of wingers out wide to create from out there. And the fact that we had Porro and Udogie there meant that we had qualitative superiority as well as more numbers. So you had more quality in midfield as well as more numbers. And often we'll see this against maybe a midfield three. So obviously we play a midfield three. We're playing against a midfield three as well. So now it's even. So to kind of one up that in the central areas, we'd have those two up that. We'd have those extra guys in there and we could dominate central areas. But this is what really confused me about this game, because Wolves were playing a 3-4-3, right? Or a 5-2-3. And they had a midfield 2, we had a midfield 3. So we already had the overload there. Plus we had our kind of best midfield, I'd say, Sarr, Bissouma and Maddison, albeit probably not all up to speed currently, but the best 3. So we already had the overload in terms of numbers, and I felt the overload in terms of quality. There was no need to kind of cramp that space anymore with the fullbacks and bring Emerson and bring Davies in there. They're not adding anything to there. They're just bringing their wingers more inside and cramping up the space for our best midfielders. So I thought, why wouldn't we just leave those two fullbacks out wide, keep those wingers away from the midfield, and let Bissouma, Sarr, Maddison dominate that central area? And I thought that really harmed us in build-up. Emerson and Davies slowed the game down. I can't face watching Emerson in build-up anymore. He's just so slow on the ball. He has to dwell on it every time he receives it. He never just pops it off first time. And I thought those two, not only the personnel, but the kind of strategy of having them inside just nullified us completely. What are your thoughts on that, Ben?
I think it's a really interesting point about Emerson, because in his kind of aesthetic makeup, he looks pretty casual anyway when he's on the ball, and I think he just dawdles a little bit too much. And like you said, in terms of the fact that we didn't necessarily adapt, if you've got Emerson and Davies playing in just a flat back 4, just being asked to defend but carry the ball forwards in transition when required, then it's not a problem. And like you said, there wasn't particularly a need to do it in this game because of the fact that we were already winning the midfield battle. And although I was really impressed with Lamina and Gomez in this game and in the reverse fixture as well, I thought Lamina massively stood out when we played them at Molineux. So I was worried about his ability to kind of break up the play, and especially how good Wolves are on the transition with Neto. And he killed us, quite frankly, on Saturday, even though he was allowed so much space for that second goal. It just felt unnecessary. I thought in terms of just the positions that they both picked up, I thought Ben Davies adapted to the role a lot better, because I do think he's more of a natural ball carrier than Emerson is anyway. And I think he's probably a little bit more intelligent in that role, even though it's more about when it arrives in the final third. Like you said, he did slow the game down a little bit, but that's not on him. And I think his ability to hold on to the ball is incomparable compared to a doggy, because of a doggy's physical makeup, like you said, and his ability to kind of almost be that box crashing central midfielder as well, to get in those positions. Davies just doesn't have that kind of game intelligence. And we saw a good example of that was the goal that Doggy scored against Newcastle, where he's basically on the line to finish it. And obviously that game was a lot more open than this one, so it was unlikely for Porro and Doggy maybe anyway, if they were playing, to be able to arrive in the box and sort of finish those chances that we've seen, as well as their kind of strength in build-up. And I think the problem was emphasised so much more on the right, because you've got Sarr still playing his natural game, still picking up exactly the same spaces, still dropping into the same spaces to receive the ball and drive forward as he would if he had Porro and Romero behind him in that kind of little triangle on the right-hand side. But I just felt watching the game, in a simple way, it just felt as if Emerson was getting in his way a lot of the time. And it was almost as if they were kind of looking at each other like, am I going to go and drive into that space, or are you going to go? And I think that comes down to the fact that Sarr still played in the natural way that he would, but he just didn't. Him and Porro have got such a good relationship down that side in that kind of channel. And I think you saw it for Sarr's goal against Brighton, where obviously the space opens up massively. Brighton are a little bit more of an expensive team anyway, but Kulusevski is able to play that pass through to Sarr because Porro makes the run that opens up the left back and the centre back, and Sarr just drives in between it. Go on, Travis.
Sorry. Yeah. What I was about, that was exactly the point I was going to make, is that in build up, when we were building up, we had the, as you mentioned, Kish, we had the overloaded midfield, which meant that I think it was often their left centre back would push up onto Sarr. I think it was Totti would push up on Sarr and follow him into midfield, or Kilman would do the same with Maddison, and that opened the space up in that channel that you were just talking about, that Porro ran into, and it creates the space. But instead of Emerson running into that space that's created by the centre-back being dragged out, he inverted inside. And it's that sort of relationship that was clearly lacking. And I just thought, if you want to play similar style fullbacks, then and we know that in those situations, Emerson's not going to be as good as Porro, but it's more about creating space in those situations than actually getting the ball. Whereas when he's receiving the ball deep in build-up, that's more about getting the ball and creating the space, I feel, especially with that right-back role. So if he was encouraged, and maybe he was, we don't know, but I feel like there was a real opportunity there for Sarr to drag in the defender, Emerson to dart into the space. He wouldn't get the ball, but Kulusevski would be in more space, and Richarlison would be in more space. And as you said, Ben, that's what got us the goals. That relationship on the right-hand side is what gets us the goals.
And I'll add to that as well. I think I would imagine that was the sort of strategy, and that it was sort of do exactly what we do usually. Don't shift the game plan for anyone. And this is how we play, and we'll dominate games in that way. Which then might lead on to Ange kind of realizing that he can't trust Emerson and Davies to do. I think Davies is fine in that. I think Emerson is probably worse. I think Davies is okay. I just think he lacks dynamism. And when he does get the ball in those situations, he can't create any separation to get a cross in or shot off or whatever. With Emerson, he looks so comfortable just receiving it, playing it, and just very, very casual. And there's nothing, he's not adding anything like intent-wise, but what he is doing is taking space from other people. And I think this is the kind of game where I'd expect Ange to adapt more, because first of all, 2 first-choice fullbacks are out. Second of all, Wolves' main threat is going to come from those transitions out wide. Neto, and who was on the other side again?
Rabi, I think, and Hwang as well.
Yeah. So Hwang's quick as well, and having those two out there, keep the wingers away from the midfield, like simplify their game, Emerson and Davies, and let kind of the rest of the system function as kind of usual. And I think them bringing them inside just nullified us completely and took away from the quality we have in midfield, which is Sarr's kind of brilliant runs in behind and Maddison's playmaking ability and Bissouma's like carrying ability. None of that was really on show because I feel like it was just so cramped in midfield, and that was a real issue. And I want to, go on, you speak to it.
No, I just wanted to go back on your point saying that Emerson adds nothing, because I think there was one moment in this match that it got the biggest cheer of the game, and no one can do an unnecessary step over like Emerson. And I think we need to appreciate that. I just wanted to put it out there before.
I was surprised that even got a cheer, because I didn't go to this game, but I was like, that was a 1-1, I think.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I was surprised people even like. I was too stressed to even like appreciate that.
I think it was one of them as well, especially like you said, I was surprised because the atmosphere was incredibly flat on Saturday. Yeah. And I know that there's been kind of a bigger dialogue around that in terms of like why that is. And we have to feed, the players have to give us something to get behind. But I would have understood that last season when we were dire to watch for, 2/3 of that year. But, you have to kind of go and get behind the team. That's kind of a separate point. But I think with Emerson, I think that was just like you said, he does kind of, you don't mind that if you're winning the game, but if it's 1-1 and it's like, you kind of just leave that for a second. But I think one of the things that irritated me a little bit about Ange's inability to adapt in game was to almost, because it was becoming so narrow in midfield, and obviously, like you said, we kind of unnecessarily overloaded when we didn't really need to and didn't get the best out of our midfield. I think his way to combat that was to bring Werner and Johnson on to play high and wide and try and stretch the pitch, when I don't think that was necessarily the answer. I think that was maybe the time to change it at the back and maybe bring Dragusin on and push Romero a little bit further forward, or even bring Højbjerg. I know Højbjerg came on later on, or maybe bring Højbjerg in to drop him a little bit deeper to kind of pick up those spaces, because he's more comfortable in those positions as well. That's kind of what his job is, or push Basuma maybe further forward. I just don't think like I don't know, like it just didn't feel like that was the right thing to do. It was almost just quite an obvious, predictable tactic of like, well, the game feels stretched. Let's bring wingers on that are going to want to get in behind and kind of attack that space, when there wasn't really the space to attack, because we were roadblocking the pitch a little bit too much. It was kind of our own doing, really.
Yeah, we couldn't even really get the ball to the wingers originally, so I don't think that was that wasn't going to ever help. It's not like we didn't have those, I guess, profiles out wide. Like Son, that is his game. Similar, like he's a lot better footballer than Werner and Johnson, but his game is off the ball movement, making those runs. And I did think like those high and wide wingers, like, yeah, great. I get that that's Ange's philosophy, but we just don't have the profiles for that in this game specifically. And all our wingers are more suited to playing narrower, and kind of, I thought in this game there were some spaces in between the fullbacks and right or left centre back, and it would have been nice to see a little bit of adaptation there and try and kind of, we didn't have the right inverted fullback, so let's push the fullbacks a little bit wider, a little bit more reserved, and let's have kind of the wingers getting in those kind of half spaces and stretching the kind of getting the right centre back and left centre back turning, really. And I think we just were so predictable. And I'm sure Gary O'Neill prepped before this game for Porro and Udogie, because it came out quite late that they were both injured. So I'm sure he prepped for that, and then maybe had a slight inkling that we were going to change it, but probably still went with the same game plan, and it completely obviously worked because you didn't even have the right fullbacks to do it.
On the subs as well.
Yeah, go on. Add what you want, and I'm going to move on to number 6.
One more thing. I didn't understand Richarlison coming off either. I thought we needed a box presence, and bringing Werner on. Even Richarlison wasn't playing well. None of the front three were, but we needed a box presence, and bringing Werner on was just going to make their jobs easier for them, and it offered something that Sutton was already doing. As you said, they weren't really getting the ball anyway. And I think that's sort of an issue in terms of Ange's in-game adaptability.
A lot of people were calling for Son to go as a number 9 as well this game, and I was like, this is literally the last game I'd put Son number 9. There's Dawson, Kilman, and Totti, 3 massive centre halves, and someone like Son is just not. He's just going to get swallowed up. Like we're barely getting into their final third anyway. Like the odd time we needed some kind of presence there to fight off centre backs, get others into play, and cause something. And Son would have just been swallowed up by those 3. Yeah, Ben, you had something to say as well.
Completely agree on that. It's like it wasn't Richarlison's day in terms of when he was dropping deeper to hold the ball up and link up the play, slipped over quite a few times. His layoffs weren't quite what they have been in the last few weeks. And I think that started against Brighton as well. The first couple of minutes of the game, his first passes to link the play to the wide players ended up both going off the pitch. And it's kind of regressed in that aspect after a really, really good run. But like Travis says, I wouldn't have taken him off because I completely agree with what you said. Like moving Sonny into the middle to play against three massively physical centre halves when there's no space in there anyway. It's kind of the sort of game that obviously I think it's a great loan move for him for Veliz to go and play in Sevilla and really adapt his game. But that's the sort of game where you want to bring him on, and hopefully for next season, I think those are the sort of games where he will get his chances and gets minutes just because he's a bit of a nuisance. And that's what Spurs need. It's like if you're putting balls into a crowded penalty area, you never know, him kind of getting across the centre half might make it drop for someone, or it's just simple stuff like that. It just didn't feel like Ange got those kind of tweaks in game right at all. We needed a presence going into those last 10 minutes because we were putting balls into the box. It became Wolves camping even further deeper into their own half, as seen by that chance for Ben Davies at the end. And then that moment that you do get that really quality delivery from Kulusevski, or combined with that lapse in concentration from the Wolves back line, you want someone like Richarlison, like Veliz in the middle to be able to finish on the end of those chances. And I feel sorry for Davies. That's not his job to be in there. It's good on him that he did. But you feel like if that's on Richarlison's head, given the form that he has been in, that he's probably 2-2. And that's the way the game was going. So I completely agree. I just think this is the first time I've come away from it. There's been moments in games where I've sort of looked at Ange and thought, I don't quite get that, but I sort of, you sort of forego it because of the football and all those kind of things and because of how well everybody's kind of feeling at the moment. And I know it's easy to say off the back of a loss, but that was the first time I've sort of walked away thinking I just didn't get that. I really didn't get it, and it could have easily been avoidable as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is one of the first time I just felt baffled by a lot of the decisions. They always sort of went against everything I was thinking we should do.
Yeah,
which is sort of the opposite. So I just didn't. I mean, I'm sure that there's of course there's method to it, but I mean, I'm sure there is, but it just didn't make sense. And yeah, I think quickly touch on Richarlison before we go. There's something like it's technically wrong with how he's linking up play in terms of every time he receives the ball, he seems to be off balance, and like it's not a couple times. It's literally when I watch him, it's even when he shoots as well. He always his standing leg always seems to like come underneath him and slip over, and then he gets like the contact wrong or he like scuffs it or whatever. It seems to be a completely like technical issue, and in my eyes, that seems like a very coachable aspect of his game. But it's definitely something that needs to be worked on because there's no way he can't just go into every game and slip over all the time. It must be a technical issue. Like, I don't know if it's like a confidence thing in terms of like he's not sure of his self when he's playing those passes. So he's not planting his foot confidently and he's not like playing firm passes into people. But yeah, that was one thing I noticed with him that was just like so frustrating. But yeah, I want to then also move on to the issues with the number 6 because I think this has been a very talked about topic, and I'm sort of losing a bit of patience with our current number 6 options. And I'll quickly just briefly touch on like why the number 6 is so important in our system, and that's because we see how high the fullbacks get. We see how much space is sort of left to Romero and Van de Ven to deal with. And that number 6, he's asked to do a lot, definitely. And it's not an easy position to play. There's a lot of space to cover. But for me, the number one responsibility for a number 6 before all the in possession stuff, and obviously we see the likes of Rodri and those guys, the first responsibility should be to hold the center of the pitch. That's literally what number 6 has to do. When your team is attacking, you need to be ready that when the ball turns over, you're going to clean up and you're going to kind of win those second balls, win those loose balls, recycle it. And that should be the primary job of a number 6 in my eyes. Like, unless you have a sort of pass heavy 6 and you have someone else a bit further forward who's cleaning up, but our number 6 should be the one who's cleaning up. And it feels like Bissouma just roams too much. He's not ever in the stereotypical number 6 position. He's like combining just outside the box, or he's like receiving the ball out wide, and then for any lapse in concentration or any kind of turnover, we're just so open. Not just in the wide areas, but also just in front of the back too. And I don't know if this is again a tactical issue or a kind of issue with Bissouma, but Travis, what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, we've got a video coming out, hopefully this week, about this exact topic. I personally think it's a mix of personnel and tactics, and I actually think that Bissouma's problems in that position and his susceptibility to roam and be caught out of position is actually exacerbated by the system itself, in that the inverted fullbacks and the aggressive positioning of them gives him that massive lateral space to cover, and he wouldn't be as prone to trying to pick up the pieces everywhere and try and cover all that ground if he had more support. So I think what it is, and I may be wrong here, is him sort of standing there and looking around and thinking, I've got to cover all that space now. I've got to cover the right of me. I've got to cover the left of me. I've got to cover in behind to try and protect Romero and Van de Ven. And that's what's making him buzz around. And it's almost counteracting his performance. It's counteracting what he wants to happen. He wants to be everywhere and sweep up every ball. But by doing that, he needs to stay central, and he needs to be more. He needs to be proactive, but sort of proactive
in a controlled way. It's in a controlled way.
In a controlled way, because he needs to be able to react to the ball once it's there, but he can't be too proactive in the sense that he's already there. He needs to move there and be proactive in his movement, but his positioning needs to be very rigid and stable in order to ensure he's the central fulcrum at it all, so he can cover all avenues.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think he loves getting on the ball, especially, and as you said, the fullbacks are in such crazy positions that he has so much space that he can use to go and get on the ball, and he can travel over to the right back position and pick it up off the Romero, or he can find himself combining with the eights, and he feels like he's so free to do that. But it is obviously harming us massively in defensive, and I just don't see him as a lone pivot player, and neither do I see Bentancur as that either. I think they're both pivot players, like double pivot players. Ben, I wanted to see if you were aware of. I didn't watch enough of Angers Celtic, but I wanted to know if either of you knew. Start with you, Ben. Like, what was their kind of primary number 6 responsibilities? Were they players who roamed a lot, or were they quite rigid in their movement? Ben, are you aware of that, or?
I think from the way that I kind of understand it, I think they were playing similar roles to what they are now, because they kind of were afforded to, in the sense that they were the most dominant team in the league, and they'd often control possession. And it didn't feel like the profiles were too dissimilar from what we've got now, from what the limited knowledge that I have. But for me, it kind of feels a bit like we've spent, don't get me wrong, like in the first kind of 7 or 8 matches of the season, Bissouma, the level that he was performing at was incredible, and he rightly kind of earned comparisons to some of the best number 6s in the league because he was showing that level. But now I think because of the system a little bit, he has, and Bentancur as well, have been exposed. And I think going back to kind of last year in those first 6 or 8 games, when obviously we were already looking, because of the level that Bissouma was performing at, we were kind of already looking ahead to AFCON thinking, well, how are we going to replace him? And obviously, I think I remember I had made a video sort of talking about, based on Bentancur's attributes, and obviously having not seen him in an Ange system yet, I thought that he would be able to do a really good job because of his ability on the ball, his kind of line breaking passing ability as well, in terms of going forward, how comfortable, how calm he is in possession. But I think in reality, I think what Spurs maybe need, and this is why I kind of think that in terms of the midfield, me and Flav from the Fighting Cock, we recorded another episode of The Lab earlier talking about our kind of summer transfer business and what we should do. And obviously there's been a lot of talk around Gallagher and De Jong and these kind of midfield profiles. But I think we've kind of already, we've already got that to an extent. Maybe not so much with Gallagher, but it feels like we've kind of got the depth in that area in terms of those number 8s, but I do think we should be maybe focusing on bringing in a number 6 who is able to just eat the ground. I mean, I think the cream has kind of risen to the top with those number 6s in the Premier League when you look at Rodri and Rice because of, one, their physical profile. If you're being left in positions where it's just down to you, as kind of Travis was alluding to earlier, because of the crazy positions that the fullbacks take up, and you're playing against a team like Wolves who have quick players in transition like Neto and Hwang, you have to stay central in your position, be disciplined, and just be comfortable not having to try to get on the ball every 5 minutes, or just be disciplined enough to stay central and just use your physical stature to just eat the ground up. That's what Rice does so well, and that's what Rodri does so well. They don't go searching for it all the time. They don't drift. They're disciplined enough to stick to their position, only really get on the ball when needed to. They know they've got the quality when they're on it. And I'm not doubting Basuma does for a second, especially Bentancur. We all know Bentancur's ability on the ball is, second to none at times. And I think we've kind of been blinded a little bit by how well he came back from injury. In the first instance, obviously that performance against Bournemouth on New Year's Eve, and I thought he was outstanding against Burnley in the Cup, albeit against poor opposition, I think, and Manchester United as well. And I think, again, I sort of think back to the Man United game at the start of the season where Basuma really kind of stamped his mark on the Premier League and put his flag in the sand and say, I am an elite midfielder at this level, because he's always backed himself, and he was incredible that day, just like Bentancur was at Old Trafford. But I think United are that sort of team that's so fractious in midfield. We saw it against Luton on Sunday, that they allow you so much space and allow the midfield. They're constantly overpowered. So again, I think maybe there's been a couple of instances where we've been hoodwinked by that. But I think my problem with Bentancur there as well, and I think you guys touched on it previously, is that he doesn't, to the naked eye, and this is kind of, I think his calmness is one of his best abilities, but sometimes it comes across a little bit too casual, and I don't think he gets his head up and scans enough. Yes. And I think
I was literally just going to say that.
Yeah. And I think that kind of lack of discipline there, coupled with Basuma's free kind of desire to constantly roam about the pitch and always want to sort of be putting out these fires. And it's something that we've criticised Højbjerg for a lot as well, his ability to look erratic and like sort of just, oh God, like it's all becomes like a little bit of it all becomes so dramatic in midfield because he's constantly trying to cover the ground because they don't stick to the position. But so, yeah, it's an interesting problem for Tottenham to solve. Yeah. And I think I would be looking at someone like, I know it's kind of an obvious link because he is great and a lot of clubs will be after him, but I think someone like Onana from Everton, who kind of does have that discipline to sort of stick in those positions and just to eat the ground up. Bear in mind, the two best number 6s in the league are locked off at the two arguably best clubs in the league right now in Arsenal and City. So I think if you're looking at realistic targets that will, especially if Everton do go down, I think that's someone that Spurs should probably be looking at as someone to come in and compete with these guys. Travis, what are you going to say?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the Bentancur point. I thought that was a great point. I've been I watch every game with my brother, and literally since the first Bentancur game, I've said he does not scan enough, and it makes me uneasy. And he does scan. It's called the critical scan. It's like just before he receives the ball, you're meant to look over your shoulder, as it's right at your feet. Just before you touch it, you're meant to look over your shoulder, and he doesn't do that. And I think that's what's got him caught out against Brighton and in deeper areas, and it's almost a deceptive casualness he portrays, and that he looks on the ball.
I don't think it's like casualness. I think it is that lack of scanning. I think his dribbling style looks casual because he can so like nicely drift past people and drop a shoulder, and same way like the Dembele look casual at times. It is the scanning. So he's not like. He just doesn't have it in his nature to check his shoulders, and I think in that position you're so often receiving it with your back to goal from the centre backs in dangerous areas that issue is just it's not like acceptable for a number 6. You can't get away with that, and which is why I prefer him further forward in the number 8, because often he's receiving it kind of side on or back from the striker, and he can see the whole pitch and then he can assess his options. Whereas he's receiving it with his back to goal in the number 6, and he's losing it in like not all the time, but when he does lose it, it can be like extremely detrimental. And that's why again I don't see him there. And then with Basuma in possession, he's for me like again on the weekend he's closing people's space. Like he's carrying it into Sarr's space, and if he was just like a bit slower in possession and a bit like more relaxed, one of their midfielders is going to have to jump and press him at times, and that then leaves up Sarr or Maddison free. I know the centre back was coming pushing on them, but he just seems like he's too. I just don't want my number 6 like doing 1-2s in and around the box and stuff like that, unless we're really camping in the other team's half where we weren't in this game.
I think that's something that Bissouma tries a lot too often, is trying those 1-2s and try and dribble past someone on the edge of the box, because he doesn't have the passing ability of someone like Bentancur, for instance, where he can punch a ball through the lines. And his best ability in possession is his press resistance and dribbling and his ability to take it round his man. And that means that when we become frustrated against deeper blocks, he wants to, in order for him to take responsibility, because he can't play those passes, he needs to dribble past someone. But the problem is against deep block is no one's pressing you. So he, rather than trying to draw in a marker and slowly moving towards them, he just runs at them and tries to engage them. And then that means that he, although he's got great dribbling ability, because the areas are so congested, he inevitably loses the ball. And because he's not waited for someone to come to him and he's gone to them, he's then attracted himself towards the front line and he's out of position and left a lot of space behind him.
Yeah, and I think the primary again attribute I look for in a number 6 is that tactical intelligence and I guess physical ability to cover ground and be smart when you're going to go and engage and when you're not. And I think in hindsight, I probably didn't think as at the start of the season in terms of Spurs, but I think defensive stability is kind of should be the primary thing we're looking for, because we've got so much quality elsewhere. As long as they can like play through the lines at times, I think we're not going to go and spend 150 million on a number 6. But there needs to be, in my eyes, like an upgrade there. And so we'll see how that kind of develops, I guess. Same with Højbjerg. I think he's too erratic. He jumps, he presses at weird times. Like they'll be on a counter attack, kind of overloading us, and he'll just jump and start pressing. And like it's like, well, no, delay until we get enough numbers back. And so I just don't think any of them are natural in that position, and it's such an important position. But yeah, I think those were kind of all the topics that I wanted to kind of touch on. Andrew, do we have any questions?
Yeah, a few. One question I saw somebody say earlier on in the show was, is the reason why Spurs are playing at 60% is because the fitness is at 60%. With all the injuries. I know that from what I've heard about Ange's Celtic teams and his previous teams, the first season is always a culture shock for injuries, for fitness, and for playing style and for personnel. So, is the main reason why halfway through the season Spurs dropped off is simply because of their fitness?
Ben, I'll let you can answer that.
Essentially, I think we've definitely been through that culture shock ourselves. And I think, unfortunately for us, we've kind of experienced it in little mini kind of crisis moments, like the Chelsea game. And obviously, you couldn't call it a crisis, but we essentially lost Porro and Udogie in one game. And I think Porro's injury wasn't necessarily directly related to the Brighton game, although he was limping for about 10, 15 minutes from what I remember, just watching him. And it was just like, I can't really understand why he's not been taken off. So I think there is definitely a period of kind of adaptation needed. And I think when looking ahead to next summer, I think it's important to remember that players like Bentancur, for example, or even some of the signings that came in later in the window, like Van de Ven, who hasn't necessarily struggled with his fitness, but obviously, of course, has picked up a significant injury along the way. But given the way he plays, that was likely to happen. He's had injuries like that in his past, so I don't think that's necessarily to do with the system. But for someone like Bentancur, for example, who isn't quite back up to full speed yet, we can all see that. That first half against Brighton told us everything we needed to know, although I thought it did grow into the game in the second half and just having more of an influence on it. But he's not had a full Ange pre-season yet. So I think we kind of need to almost, when looking ahead to next year, I think that's something that's important to factor in, that some of these players haven't been through that yet. Maddison, again, is one of those players that doesn't quite look up to it at the moment. And again, I think when you're a player in those kind of positions, when you're going to be roughed up a lot by centre backs pressing onto you and midfielders, I think they did a really good job of effectively not necessarily marking Maddison out the game, but as soon as he got the ball on Saturday, as we've quite often experienced, there will be players that swarm around him. And given the fact that he's picked up a lot of ankle injuries, I think he's almost quite conscious of that a lot of the time as well. So maybe there's an element of him playing within himself. I'm not 100% sure. I think Maddison, again, almost sort of said about Emerson as well, in kind of his aesthetic makeup. There is something that frustrates me a little bit about Maddison sometimes in a few aspects, but one of them is almost just like that willingness not necessarily to engage a lot of the time because you feel like you're going to get kicked, and he doesn't necessarily ride those moments quite well. And I think another one of those on kind of a tangent, and I can't remember whether you guys said about it before or someone else did, about his willingness to always play with the outside of his foot. And it's kind of like what sometimes worries me with Maddison, kind of bringing it back to the aesthetics, is that he almost looks, rather than trying to, like, I don't know, it's a bit of a tangent and it's probably a question for another time. But in terms of the fitness, I do think it would take us another pre-season at least to kind of get this squad fully up to the levels of what Ange Postecoglou is kind of demanding from them. And I think, to bring it back to something you said at the start of the show about the fullbacks, I think Porro's covered the most ground for us in the Premier League. He's played the most minutes of any outfield player, and I think Udogie is third on that list as well. And given the workload that's kind of they're being tasked with in terms of off the ball and on the ball, and given the fact that we are so aggressive, which means that they have to come back and make those runs back to cover the space, then you're going to be asking a hell of a lot of these players. So I think part of me thinks that we should kind of give them that leniency because the demands are so high. But I also think that, I'm not saying it's necessarily down to the players, but I think overall, I think we just need to kind of get these players through another pre-season under Ange, the full squad at it, the full player, all of the players that you're going to play for the most part, because Bentancur is going to play an important part for Spurs, you'd imagine, for the next few years. And for someone who's suffered a lot with injuries, like Van de Ven as well, it's kind of important for them to kind of get through that and really get up to the pace. So it's a tricky one. I don't really know the answer.
I think just before we move on to the next question, I think with Maddison as well, in that position, it's so much about rhythm and muscle memory, and the margins are so small in the number 10 position, where one split second dwelling on the ball or one kind of split second delaying a pass, the opportunity goes. And I think he needs to get up to speed in terms of match sharpness rather than anything else. And that will come, I think.
I think you also try, and you mentioned Emerson in the same sort of sentence in the terms of aesthetic side of it. And they do have something like, they both look for fouls a lot and they draw a lot of fouls.
Yeah.
And with Emerson, that's great. And that's what you sort of want a fullback to do, especially when he's not necessarily got the technical capabilities to create himself. But whilst Maddison is great at drawing fouls, I do feel sometimes he looks for it too often.
Yeah.
And as you said, he doesn't ride those tackles. So when he feels the contact, he goes down. And one, that is probably partly a reason for his injuries, in that he's always looking to draw fouls. And it's great, and it buys us some time occasionally, and it buys us a foul in a good position. But as you said, Kish, it means he's trying to delay things a bit more.
Yeah.
And when you delay, the opportunity goes.
Yeah. Andrew, any more questions?
Yeah. I got two more I'd like to ask. The first one is a question that I think everybody's asked in the chat, like every single person. Who are the targets for the number 6 position? What are the profiles? What are the names that at least Spurs can inspiration from?
Yeah. For me, obviously, I think Onan is a great shout. I think I don't think he's excellent in possession, but he's good enough. He's more than good enough. And I think out of possession, he's like elite. I think he's got that physical stature. He can like run for days. And so, yeah, I think he's perfect. In terms of someone who's slightly different, I'd say Zubimendi at Sociedad. He'll be pretty expensive, I think. But he's a sort of, like Rodri mold DM with like very good game IQ. Can do it all, but is very smart in possession, very smart out of possession. And like that's a typical number six, Spanish number six, who's kind of game IQ is just like above the average player. So who else I can think of? I do think there's a bit of a limitation in the market for number sixes. I think, which is why the Rices, the Caicedos are going for such huge fees. I think that shows how kind of scarce the market is there. So they're the only ones I can think of.
I'm not sure. I don't think there's a lot on the market, as you said, because it's such a rare profile that you need. I think what we might need to do is bring in someone who can sort of complement our midfield profiles better. And that's why I don't know about Onana. I think he'd work brilliantly, but I think he's too similar to the profiles we already have. And I think personally we need a bit more of a passer rather than someone he's
quite similar to Sarr.
He's quite
similar to Sarr in terms of the ground they can cover.
Exactly.
He's probably more of a holder, but I don't think Sarr can't do that either.
Great.
Andrew, next question.
Yeah, just gonna finish it off now. Big game against Palace. Spurs should be winning, but obviously they'll have the new manager bound to Glasner, and he already have one match under his belt before that game. Also, I think they're playing in a few days. Glasner notoriously plays with a back. I think he plays with a back five or back three.
Yeah.
It'll be tough to break down. And he's an experienced manager with European silverware already. So, how should very, very briefly, how should Spurs line up? How should they approach the game? And what are all your score predictions, really quickly?
I think that's in 2 weeks, right? That game. So, Doggy back or not back? Do you know?
I heard Poro's for 2 or 3 weeks. Udogie should be back. Poro, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think Udogie's more certain. Yeah.
I think I wouldn't be 100% sure that he's going to go with the back three straight away. Just because I think they've got a real lack of good centre backs.
He is.
I think he did it last. I think.
Last night they played a back three and he wasn't even like in the dugout. And they've
they shifted to a back three, right. But who was their three centre backs last night?
Their three centre backs were Joel Ward, Anderson, and Richard. But Gay's
still injured,
But they looked.
Did he play a 3-4-3 or a 3-5-2?
He played a 3-4-3. Yeah. They looked very good. I like considering it was just one game. They looked decent, and I think that they're. I don't know whether Eze and Elise will be back, but I think their profile really they're not. But neither of them are back.
I think Elise definitely not, but I think Eze is sooner. But I'm not sure if that's soon enough to play us.
They looked like they set up in a similar way to Wolves, albeit they would certainly be less compact than Wolves, just in terms of their discipline. I don't think they have the ability to carry it out as well as and effectively as Wolves did. They played a 3-4-3. Their wing backs weren't very attacking at all. I think it was Munoz and Mitchell who aren't wing backs essentially. It was a very conservative team, and I think that we will be able to get at them because it's the sort of game where they will be threatening on the counter-attack, but without Elise and without Eze, they're less threatening. And I also think that because it's so early on, and just because of, and yes, I'm just going off one game, but they will be trying to sit deep and counter-attack, but I don't think they'll have the compactness that means we can't exploit it. And that's something that we struggled against with Wolves and Brentford. Not necessarily just a 5-3-2 with men behind the ball. It was the compactness and the way they were restricting space. And I don't think Palace will be able to do that because simply they don't have the same level of player as Brentford.
But I also think they won't. Wolves, yes, they were playing in transition, but they were also pretty aggressive. They were like, I think Palace will be more of a game where it's like breaking down a low block. So it'll be a different type of game. I don't think they'll have much going forward, but I think we struggle breaking down low blocks as well. So it might be a different kind of struggle, but we'll see. With Maddison fit again, I don't think we've faced a proper low block since he's been back. So I I'd be hopeful that we'll bounce back. I won't like I don't see us not winning that game. Yeah, Travis, go on.
No, Ben, I think you were going to say something on that game.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I do feel like these kind of next 2 weeks will do us good. I do think it's kind of that reset that we need. Like, I know people have said how good Arsenal have been since they had that kind of couple of weeks off and that winter break. And obviously we had that same period as well. But I do think off the back of, we kind of went into that winter break off the back of a positive result after Manchester United. So it was like after a negative one, I think we kind of need this time just to sort of reset and go again. And I think that Palace, although I was impressed with Palace last night from what I saw. I was really impressed with Wharton. I think a lot of Palace fans are far more encouraged from what they've seen in terms of their ability to be compact, especially with players playing completely out of position as well. Like they mentioned the two wing backs, but Joel Ward as well on the right side of a three is not anywhere near what they're going to be in their final form. But Spurs aren't going to play them at that because, like I said, they won't have Elise as a back. And as much as that front three for them last night, and Ayew scored a brilliant goal, that front three is more about hard work rather than dynamism. And whereas with Wolves, you've got the mixture of both. You've got real quality in that front three. So I'm not as worried about Palace on the transition as Wolves. But I just, like Hish kind of says, I do think it's going to be one of those. It's probably going to be one of the deepest blocks that we have faced because Palace don't have the ability to be threatening, or certainly have anywhere near the ability as Wolves did to kind of be that threatening on the transition. So they're going to set up and try and make a point. They've got Burnley at home on Saturday, so it'll be interesting to see how they kind of set up for that one. And I think we'll probably get more of a steer of how they will look to attack. But it's going to be, I think we've probably got to set ourselves up for an incredibly frustrating afternoon. But I think it is one of those ones that becomes no excuses as well, because there is a 75% chance that we're going to have both Porro and Udogie back. Udogie should definitely be back. So we're going to be facing them with pretty much our first team. Maddison, another kind of 2 weeks recovery in the tank, although to counteract that, we did say the thing that he's lacking is his sharpness. And, with his creativity, he can thrive against low blocks. So I think it's going to be a real acid test of where he's sort of at and how much he wants to take that game by the scruff of the neck. So it'll be interesting to see how we set up, but it's going to be tricky.
I'm pretty sure we'll all come out of that game thinking, "Damn, we should have got Wharton." And I didn't watch him. I didn't watch him enough. I barely watched him at Blackburn. I've just seen like reels and I've read stuff about him. But the first two games I've watched him, he has been exceptional.
Yeah, he'll go for crazy money. I'm sure of it.
He's incredible. He was he obviously came on against Brighton, I think, in like the first 20 minutes. I'm pretty sure he was playing at centre back when they got battered in that game, and it was like everyone was like, "Oh, they brought this kid from the Championship," and it was like because he got done for I think the fourth goal, he stepped out, and they I think it was Welbeck or João Pedro who backheeled it in behind for the fourth goal, and it was like everyone was sort of saying about, I thought this kid was, but in the last couple of games where he's played in his position, I thought he was superb against Chelsea, and last night as well. He's been really, really impressive.
I think the Championship's got
so much talent,
and I think the amount of good value deals can be done for players that could go on to be like world class. I don't think we use it enough. But that's a conversation for another
when we try to, we sell them back there and then they thrive.
Rip it out. All right, guys, that's all good for today. Thank you everyone who's tuned in. We've got a couple videos coming out in the next 2 weeks. So we've got one on sort of what Ange looks for in terms of profile of signing and everything he kind of looks for in a player to bring to the club, and the other one's on some of the stuff we touched on today with the number 6 and kind of some of the issues there. Look out for those. Obviously we'll be back with another lounge possibly next week, but definitely the next week after if depending obviously on the Palace result. That's it. Thank you everyone for coming. Ben, thanks for coming. Travis, thanks as always.
Thanks, Kish.
Thanks, Andrew, as well.
Appreciate it.
See you later, guys.